Is it? Okay. All right, great. So if you remember, we're in a brand new section. That's the training of the 12. And so this is really the focus of this particular area as we get into this here is on training the disciples for taking over for Christ. And again, like I said, prior to this, they pretty much just trailed along and just watched them do stuff. And, they didn't really have a part. You look at the gospel accounts and they're just kind of 12 tag-alongs. And now he's gonna flip it. And there's going to be a lot of things he's going to ask them to do, but there's also going to be a lot of training that's specific to them. And he needs them in a very quick span of time to be able to learn these lessons because he knows, even though he'll tell them, they won't recognize and they won't believe that anything is going to change. They still think the kingdom's coming. They still think they're going to sit on these thrones next to him, whatever. So they're not prepared. They think they're going to continue to tag along and it's all going to be great. And so it's going to be a struggle. And you're going to see the disciples not understanding. You're going to see them failing. You're going to sometimes see them with right answers, sometimes wrong answers. And so this is what this next section is he really needs to get this information to them and to train them in a very short period of time. Now, we started this section last week with the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And we looked at that as a situation in which Jesus tested them. Remember, he told them when they said there's no food here, he said, well, then what? What did he say? What did he say to them? When they said there's no food, what was his response to them?
Feed them.
Right. You feed them. And they were like, impossible, can't do it. And he's like, okay. And then he, does it himself. But his command was, you go do it. And then remember, they had returned from a very successful ministry of healing and casting out demons. So they'd seen all these supernatural miracles. And his whole point last week was, okay, now, no, you're telling me to feed them. I'm not going to do it. I'm asking you to do it. And yet you go, don't know what to do. And so they failed last week, right? They were successful in their two by two mission, but then last week they failed. Now we're going to actually see that because tonight's lesson is actually going to explicitly state that they failed to recognize the lesson they should have learned in the feeding of the 5,000.
Would the right response have been, Lord, we can't do it, but with your help, we can do it. What I mean,
Yeah.
Like good
So
application.
So the question is what would have been the right response? Because obviously they responded, looked around and said, not enough. Even if we had the money, we couldn't do it. There's not enough food in the area to do it. You're right. The right response would have been for them to say, Lord, we're not sure where this is going to be or how it's going to happen. There's not enough food. We don't have anything here. By the time we go into town, it's already super late at night, right? Everyone's exhausted. However, you have asked us to do that, and we'll trust you. What do you need us to do? Or some kind of response of that, of turning and say, because you've asked this, we know that you won't ask us to do something that we can't do. Otherwise, there's no purpose of a command. So that would have been the right response. But instead, all they do is point out the obvious, and then they don't ask him for help. They don't ask him to help us to understand how we can do that or whatever the case is. So they actually failed that. And tonight we're going to actually learn that they're going to fail a second time. There's going to be 3 tests that he gives, and they only pass 1. They fail 2, right? So that's kind of what we're going to get into tonight. Now, the first thing that we want to do, though, is we want to look at the rejection, Jesus' rejection of the Galileans' attempt to make him king, right? And then we'll get to the very famous Jesus and Peter walking on the water story. And again, that'll be the next test, which they will of course, also fail. All right, so let's talk about the rejection of the Galileans' offer to make him king, right? So Matthew 14:22, and also in Mark's account, it says immediately, and then Mark also says immediately. So again, this happens right after they fed the crowd. He's asked them to gather up all the baskets. They got the 12 basketfuls. And then it says, immediately after that was done, so they sort of ended the dinner time, the teaching is done, then this next event happens, right? And so it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Again, the yellow highlighted are the things that are different in the accounts, right? So when we get to Mark, it says that he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd, right? Bethsaida, that's going to be back in not Gentile territory, because remember, the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Gentile territory. This is going to be back in Jewish territory. So in other words, he's sending them back into Jewish territory at this point.
Because he was King Herod, John the Baptist situation.
Correct. And it says he went up to the mountain to pray. Okay, now again, the mountain it's not necessarily what we would think is a mountain. It's not Mount Horeb or Mount Carmel or anything like that. It's more foothills, but they're large foothills. They're certainly mountainous, but not like we would think of our mountains around here. John chapter 6 says this. Now, John gives us a lot of information that the others didn't. He said, when the people saw the sign, again, the feeding of the 5,000, that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Okay, so that is the event. Now, again, these results here are a direct result of the feeding of the 5,000 plus Galileans. Well, they're not Galileans. A lot of them came from Galilee, so they're probably mostly Galileans. But it is in Gentile territory. Now, a couple results of this are going to happen, right? So first thing is that the people that got fed are going to have a very strong reaction to what Jesus did, right? But then the other thing is that Jesus is going to use the feeding of the 5,000 as his teaching point for his disciples. So he's going to take a very purposeful step in sending them off by themselves. We'll kind of answer that question. Why doesn't he get in the boat with them? Because everywhere that Jesus, it's like Mary had a little lamb, everywhere that Mary went, the sheep were sure to follow. Like, that's what you see in the gospel accounts, for the most part, is wherever Jesus is, they are. But in this case, it's not the case. And so this whole feeding of the 5,000, this miracle, is going to set up those two types of actions or reactions to that account, right? And what we see from that is that, immediately after it's fed, he sends the disciples, tells them to get in a boat and leave, right? There's no reason necessarily given for that. And so he sends them off. Now, when he sends them off, the crowd is still here, right? So the crowd's still there, and they are now going to clamor for him to become their king. So the disciples have gotten in the boat and they're gone. So they don't really actually witness this event that is happening here in the shore of the mountain area, the hill area. Again, this is the question that we have here is why did Jesus not go with the disciples? Because it's pretty intentional, right? It wasn't that Jesus said, "Hey, I got some friends and relatives here. I'd like to stay and spend the weekend and come back." Like, there's very purpose that he compelled them to go, right? If you come back and you look at it here, it says that he made his disciples, right? He made his disciples get into the boat. So there's a compulsion for them to actually do it. It's very intentional, his actions.
I mean, he saw them go out there intentionally. I mean, it was all intentional.
Totally intentional. So why would he do that, right? Now, there's a couple reasons. Again, it doesn't say. The text actually doesn't tell us why. We have to sort of surmise about what we see happen afterwards as the reason for that. So I think the answer is actually pretty clear and pretty obvious. But correct. So the first thing is, he had just performed this miracle. One of them is just really very pragmatic, very practical. We see this with Christ a lot, where he gets tired, he gets weary, he needs to be alone, actually, and he needs for prayer and for renewal with God. And so we see this quite often, and this is his practice, which tells us that, look, if he needs that, we probably all need to do those types of things. So part of it is that he has spent the day, and there's been large crowds. He's been teaching them. He's done this miracle, and now he needs to be by himself. And, frankly, the 12 disciples, if they're anything like you see in The Chosen, they're kind of a, cantankerous, they're 12 kind of goofballs, right? And so sometimes it's probably, he just needs to kind of get away from that. So that's probably one of the reasons for that. In fact, the text explicitly says that he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. So he wanted to be by himself for prayer time. Okay.
That's a big deal, but the feeding of 5,000 occurred in Bethsaida.
Oh, sorry. It should be, yeah, they're going to Bethsaida. I actually, yes, there's a mistake on that. Yeah. Yeah. The second thing is that he does it so that he can test the disciples, right? And we're going to actually see this in the very next account, right? He wanted them to be on their own, because when they're on their own, they've got a choice. When they're faced with difficulties, what do? Do they rely on themselves, or do they rely on him, right? And he's already seen it one time where he sent them out 2 by 2, and they were empowered by the Holy Spirit to do all of these amazing, incredible things. They actually, in faith, operated the way that they should have, and there was tremendous results, right? Now he's going to send them out, and he needs them to be on their own to test them. What are they going to do, right? So the separation is actually an intentional act by him to teach him that next lesson. Now, after they've been sent away, and before he goes up on the mountain to pray, so I imagine the scene is something like this. He tells them to get in the boat. His disciples get in the boat. They start to row away, put up the sails, whatever, and they start to go out there. And he turns around, and then the crowd is there. And the language here is really interesting, because it wasn't really a request on their part. Okay, the Galileans have decided that they want to make him king. Now, a couple reasons for that, obviously, and I know, see, my numbering's not right here. The first one is he's just performed this incredible miracle. They know that he has raised people from the dead. He's done all these. In fact, earlier that day, they were healing the sick and whatever else. So they've seen him do all this. And then he has now provided this food. Now, if you think about back in that time period, one of the most important things anyone could do would be able to provide food. Because unlike us, you can't go to Safeway. I mean, food was difficult. Meat was expensive. It was hard to come by. You lived off of bread and fruits, and there's a lot of those things that are basic parts of it. And in order to eat the bread, you had to actually go get it. You had to it had to be ground. It had to be, I mean, it's a process. I mean, any of you that have made bread know that it takes a while to do. And we're talking about in a society without electricity. So to have someone that can provide just like that, out of thin air, what you need is a very basic part of your sustainability, to them is a big deal. Like, this is actually probably goes beyond just a healing. Like, I might see you healed, and maybe I don't need to be healed. So, well, that may be nice, and that may demonstrate Jesus' power, and maybe one day I'll need healing, and maybe that'll be important. When you provide bread, you meet everybody's needs, the basic need of absolutely everybody. So I think that compulsion for them was, we found the person that can keep us from this hard and difficult life. And it was hard and difficult life. Just to basically survive was not the easiest thing in the world. And we see here that John says that when the people saw the sign that he had done, again, the feeding of the 5,000, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world, right? Now, they correctly understand that Jesus is in fact the prophesied or the promised prophet back in Deuteronomy by Moses. So they actually come to the correct theological conclusion, right? Now, if we go back, we find out that in fact Moses did prophesy that there would be a prophet that would arise, and that this is what Israel was always looking for, was this prophet in addition to the Messiah. Now, Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18:18 says this. This is Moses writing here. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. All right. Now, that's what Moses prophesied. Now, what made this prophet that Moses prophesied, what made that prophet unique? Because Israel had lots of prophets. You got Samuel, you got Isaiah, you got Ezekiel, you got Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. I mean, you got all these. Yeah, there you go. You have all of these prophets, but this isn't who Moses is talking about. So what makes this prophet unique, right? That the people are still looking for him, and they recognize that the prophet wasn't any of the prior prophets that had come before them, right? So the first thing we need to see here is that, a prophet is, of course, one who speaks God's word and typically provides God's deliverance or messages of God's deliverance. If you do this, you will survive. If you don't, there'll be punishment. That's typically the message throughout the Old Testament of the prophets, is this idea of God's delivering God's words, and typically, most of the time, that message is around deliverance for Israel if they in fact obey God. But we actually get one of the key things that makes this prophet different than the rest of the prophets, and it's this. It says in Deuteronomy 34, 10 through 12, since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Okay? For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So, a couple things that make Moses unique. Now, let's talk about here the first thing, the signs and wonders. Now, when we look at the Old Testament prophets, most of the prophets didn't do miracles. They were just God's mouthpiece proclaiming either judgment, typically judgment, or God's message, but they didn't perform miracles. You don't see, Ezekiel and Isaiah, you don't see them doing that. You do see Elijah and Elisha performing miracles, right? So signs and wonders were not unique to Moses, but they were fairly unique among the prophets, right? Because it wasn't that big of a thing for the prophets to be doing these signs and wonders, right? And these mighty power, the other thing is that he did the mighty power for all the great terror which Moses performed, and this is key, in the sight of all Israel. So while you have, Elijah and Elisha, many of their miracles were miracles that were very secluded, very local, right? Axe heads floating on the water, raising of a widow's son. You've got some of those things there, but you don't see a lot of you got Mount Carmel, which is probably like the biggest demonstration, that you have Elijah up there. But most of it was done in like little pockets. It wasn't done in the way that Jesus has been going around all Israel, and that's why the masses are following him. So, Moses was fairly unique in the fact that he did all these magnificent signs for all Israel to see. And in that way, this prophet would be someone that would not just do miracles, but would do miracles that would be very public for the nation. But probably the most unique thing that we get from Deuteronomy 34:10 is this, is the prophet, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None of the other prophets were face to face with God. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, goes in the cave, gets hidden. God basically, he sees his backside, whatever. I mean, but he was face to face sort of with Moses in a way that none of the other prophets saw visions, right? Like Ezekiel seeing visions and stuff like that, but none of them encountered God in this face-to-face manner. That was a unique thing that Moses was able to do, that God had this relationship. So this prophet then is going to be one like Moses, one that is going to encounter God face-to-face. We already know that because the Son,
You've seen the Father.
you've seen the Father, you've seen the Son. We have this going to be, of course, at his transfiguration, right, where there's going to be this intimate experience that we have. And of course, he's doing all these signs and wonders for the side of Israel. So in this way, this prophet, the people knew that this prophet was going to be different, and in ways that Deuteronomy 34:10 through 12 actually points out. The other thing, now they wouldn't have known this, but I just want to point this out here. Moses was the mediator of the old covenant. And so this prophet, this new prophet, is going to be the mediator of the new covenant. Right now, the crowds wouldn't have known that, but we know the connection between a prophet unto Moses, like unto himself, is this idea of mediation of covenants, old covenant versus new covenant. The other thing that we have here that we've studied already a little bit is that, remember, Moses delivered the standard by which all the other prophets had to live up to. He had the Mosaic Law, he delivered the Mosaic Law, and the Mosaic Law then became the standard of righteousness that the righteous prophets adhered to. And it was, in fact, the fact that the nation broke the laws, the Mosaic Law, that they were under condemnation and judgment. So Moses set that standard through the Mosaic Law. Christ, as we know, when we studied the Sermon on the Mount, he provided the correct, righteous interpretation of the Mosaic Law, but then we also see in his ministry, he then starts to provide his own interpretation, not interpretation, but his own laws, the laws of the Messiah, which we call the law of Christ. Because remember, the Mosaic Law is abolished, no longer in effect after Christ has died. And so Christ establishes this new law of Christ, which is what Paul and the New Testament writers refer to that, is this law of the Spirit or the law of Christ. And so in this way, Moses set that standard. Christ sets the standard for believers to follow. He sets the standard for righteousness. Does that all make sense? Okay. All right. So they correctly understood this. So here they have this, the prophet has arrived, the Messiah has arrived, and they knew the Messiah was going to be king. That was prophesied in the Old Testament. So they now, the light has come on for them in a way that perhaps it hadn't come on before. That's why they want to do this. Like, great, he's here. Let's make him king, right? Why should we wait? Why wait? I mean, the king is here. Look what all he does. I mean, who can stop the person who can make food out of thin air? Who can stop the person who can raise people from the dead? Let's just make him king right now. So
Physically versus spiritual, right? Difference.
well, yeah, they weren't thinking that from the spiritual perspective. They were thinking of, again, the Messiah. Well, in the Messiah, even if we don't take it like a more of a, I don't want to say selfishly, but more of an inward look, the Messiah in the Old Testament, the vast majority of the messianic prophecies and stuff in the Old Testament are about him setting up his kingdom, his physical kingdom, about abolishing war, about the peace that reigns on earth, all of this type of stuff. And so it isn't necessarily about me, but if he's here, let's get rid of all of this oppression. Let's get rid of all of this war. Let's have it where I don't have to fight for making bread in the morning. Like, the messianic prophecies were the food and everything, it's all going to just flow. It's just going to be this incredible experience. Well, he's here now, so let's install him as king. Why? There's no reason to wait. That's the impetus for their reaction, right? All right. Now it says here that Jesus, knowing that they were going to take him by force, right? And again, the Greek there is really strong. They were not going to take no for an answer. Now, we don't actually have their request. All we have is Jesus understanding what they were planning on doing, and then that they were planning on taking by force, right? And so this was a interesting situation, because if he had allowed them to do that, that would have been extremely problematic. So it doesn't tell us how he gets out of this. We don't really know. I mean, there's a large crowd there. There's probably 15, 20 plus thousand people there. He's one person. And it says they were trying to take him by force. So I don't know how he did it, but somehow he manages to escape their clutches, to escape that, and refuse their offer of king. And then it says that he then goes up on the mountainside alone to pray. So obviously he was able to get away. Whether or not he just like vanished into thin air and appears on the hillside or some other type of thing went on, but he is able to do that. Now, we got a question here. Why did Jesus refuse their offer? I mean, clearly they recognize him as the Messiah, they recognize him as the prophet, and they recognize him as king. That's perfect. Why would he refuse that? I've got the
Quick question.
yes.
So if these are all Gentiles,
No, these are Jews. They came in, they were Jews that followed him into Gentile territory.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. I was thinking that they were all Gentiles in Gentile territory. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Then that
He-
answers my question.
yeah, he went there, but remember they had walked about 10 miles.
right, okay, I remember.
Yeah. So, yeah.
There's 3 reasons
Well, it's actually more than 3.
for that item.
Well, that's really no. Okay. Tell you what, we'll cover those, and there may actually be more, but I think that these are probably pretty close. The first one should be obvious to everyone that's been part of the study, is that, yeah, the Jewish leadership had already rejected him, and the unpardonable sin had happened, and the offer of setting him up as king for that Jewish generation is under judgment, is not going to happen. It doesn't matter how many times. In fact, they'll do it again. The Palm Sunday, they're going to do it again. And you know what? He's going to go in and he's going to turn right around. And I'm sure that they were like, what in the world is going on? And that's because of the fact that the unpardonable sin, it's unpardonable. Doesn't matter. The whole nation, in fact, every single person in the nation could have said, all right, we've come to our senses, including the Pharisees, everyone else said, we come to our senses, let's do this thing. And he would have said no. Because remember, the unpardonable sin, this is the 3rd time that type of sin has happened in the history of Israel. And the first one is when the Jews were at Kadesh Barnea, and they were supposed to go to the promised land, and the spies came back, and 10 of them said, no, they're too big, and it's, they're giants, and blah, blah, blah. And the people refused, and then Moses said, okay, because of that, you're not going to go to the promised land. Well, then what did they do immediately after that? They turn around and say, okay, we'll do what God wants. And they try to go up in the promised land. They get their clocks cleaned. And then it says that they repented. And the text even says God forgave them. But because they had committed an unpardonable sin, they had refused to go over, God said that Jewish generation was going to die in the wilderness. It didn't matter how many of them came back and said, we're wrong, please forgive us. And it doesn't even matter that God forgave them. The judgment for their action was set in stone. It was irrevocable. Same thing that we have going on here. And again, this is the 3rd time an unpardonable sin has been committed by the nation. The other one was with King Manasseh, which led, of course, to the Babylonian captivity. That was an unpardonable sin. The Babylonian captivity was going to happen. It was just a matter of when. The second thing, though, is that, the Old Testament said, hey, look, the Messiah is going to be king over the world, but his throne is going to be in Jerusalem on Mount Zion. It's not going to be in some podunk place over here in Galilee or any other place like that. So the fact that these Galileans wanted to make him king, this wasn't the Judeans, right, which is where Jerusalem is at. This wasn't the nation. This was like a small little group. This would be like Washington State deciding that, hey, we'll set you up down in Olympia. It's like, no, Washington, D.C. is where the president sits, right? That's the same thing that's going on here. Now we see from Psalm 2, 1 through 6, verse 1, it says, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Of course, Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm, right? And there's more to Psalm 2 than just verses 1 through 6. But it's clear that the Messiah is going to be enthroned. This is just one of many Old Testament passages that talk about it's going to be in Jerusalem, not some place in Galilee, okay? The other thing is that the timing wasn't right, okay? And what I mean by that is if he had accepted their offer, what would have happened immediately is that the Romans would have seen that as insurrection, as rebellion against Rome, and they would have come and tried to destroy him and killed him, okay? So the timing wasn't right because he wasn't intended to die at that Passover, because remember, this is at Passover time, or right before it. He was intended to die a year later at the next Passover, because this next year is part of his training of his disciples. So if he does this now, and the Romans come and they kill him, his disciples are not ready. So the timing itself wasn't right. Even if their offer was right, it's still, and they hadn't committed the unpardonable sin, it still wasn't the right time. It would have been delayed at least by another year. And of course, the motive of the Galileans is wrong, as we're going to learn not this week, but the next time that we meet in John chapter 6, that the reason why they wanted to be king is they wanted their bellies full. And that's just what Jesus says. Look, you came to me and you still follow me because I gave you food. Like, you know, I'm your meal ticket. And that's the only reason why you're really doing. Now you recognize who I am, but you don't worship me for who I am. You don't, yeah, you call me king, but you don't want to treat me like king. You want me to just be your handout type of thing. And that's what we're going to have in John chapter 6. So their motives were completely wrong. And so those are the 4 reasons that I can think of for why he decides to do it. And of course, at the very end of this, he goes up to the mountain and he prays for a very long time. In fact, likely he prays for anywhere between 6 to 9 hours, right? So I don't think I've ever prayed for 6 to 9 hours straight, but apparently that is what it looks like happened. Is an extended period. Any questions on the Messiah's rejection of the offer to make him king by the Galileans? Okay.
Jews in Galilee, right?
The Jews that in Galilee they
There-
came.
There are probably some mixed in there.
Correct, and they're actually gonna come back when they go back to Capernaum. They're gonna come back and they're gonna find him again, and they're gonna want him to make more bread. So this is where this whole discourse, is super lengthy discourse on the bread of life that John records. That's the result. Is he leaves them on this hillside. He goes out and, you know, just to spoil the story here, he's going to, you know, get into his disciples, and immediately they're going to come to land. Well, these people are wondering where in the world he's gone, and when they figure out where he's gone, then they have to make the trek all the way back. And then when they get back there, of course, they're hungry again.
They're just looking for Jesus, the sugar daddy.
That's right. Jesus, the sugar daddy. They want him to open up shop, and they just come on in and grab their fish and bread and call it good. Yes.
So I was wondering, when Peter was walking on water, did this happen like right after the feeding of the 5,000?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And that's what we're going to get to right now. Yeah. So 6 to it all depends on, it's not exact, but we'll get there. It's probably around 9 to 10 hours, probably somewhere around there. All right, so this next part that we're going to cover tonight is the training of the disciples through the storm, right? And so we have 3 different accounts here, and they all have slightly different variations, and I apologize that I didn't highlight in yellow the variants. So I will read through them, and we'll kind of pick apart the variants here between the different gospel accounts. In Matthew chapter 14, it says, but the boat by this time, again, he's compelled his disciples to get in the boat. So they're in the boat. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly you are the Son of God. Mark's version says this, and when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And he got in the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So this again now is Mark's reference to what happened. They did not understand. They had not learned the lesson from the loaves, right? And that's pretty explicit here. Okay. John 6 says this, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got in the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed for about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, and coming near the boat, they were frightened. But he said to them, It is I, do not be afraid. When they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. All right, so those are the 3 accounts that we have.
First, quick question.
Yeah.
So why didn't Mark and John bring up the walking on the waterbed?
Oh, here's a question. Why did Mark and John?
Detail to leave out.
Well, okay.
Especially
So to-
since Mark was Peter.
Yeah, so here's the answer to the question, because Mike had the same question. We don't know. Because just like all the other gospel accounts, each gospel writer picks out things that are important to their theme or what they're trying to get across, right? And so we've seen it all along where one will mention something, another one will mention something else. And why one picked one thing and why one picked another, sometimes it's kind of obvious, right? Like sometimes Luke will say things about a person's physical condition in more detail than others because he's a doctor, right? So sometimes that makes sense. Other times it's just we don't really know why they did it. Now, it is a little bit odd, although I don't think it's completely unexpected because, Mark was basically the scribe of Peter, right? Mark's not one of the disciples. He wrote the Gospel of Mark, but that's because he was basically Peter's tag along. He was the recorder, just like Luke with Paul, right? So you've got Luke recording that. So Mark is Peter's sort of scribe, right, in this gospel account down. So it's likely, well, I don't know if it's likely. Look, I have no idea if it's likely or not. But, I'm not sure that Peter, when he's recounting all this, I'm not sure exactly. There might be some things that he might have just left out. I don't know.
It's a big deal. Peter walking on water.
But it's also a failure on his part. Like he failed. So we don't know. I don't really know why that occurred there, and we don't know why Matthew. Now Matthew does tend to be, in general, the more detailed out of the gospel writers. Although we've seen places where Matthew's very truncated compared to, let's say, Luke gives a very expanded account. So the answer to the question is we don't know. There doesn't seem to be anything intrinsic in the story that would point to Matthew's interested in this theme, therefore it makes more sense for Matthew to do that than it might be to Mark or John. The only other thing that I would say that might be the case is that Matthew's theme is what? Jesus the Messiah, the what? Jesus the Messiah. So Luke was Jesus the Messiah, right? Son of man, right? Okay. All right.
Fill in the blanks.
All right, here we go. So Matthew's is Jesus the Messiah, the King of the Jews. So his is about the kingship of Christ. Now, one of the things that we're going to find out here is that it's possible um, it's possible that there's something in here about that where there's a recognition by Peter of specifically Peter and Matthew wants to call that out, that because there is a divine element of it, although it's not necessarily called out in Matthew's account as it is in the other. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know, and I haven't found anyone else that does know, right? You look at it, but it's a great question. All right.
To the Romans and the Gentiles, right?
Yes.
The kingship, and then John, wrote
Son of God. Yeah.
Son of God.
Jesus. Yeah. Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Correct.
So I guess the walking on water is that Peter. Well, I mean, because I can see that because Matthew's going to write to the Jews, and that's their group of people right there. And so Mark is writing to the world, and John.
Oh,
is
Mark's writing to the
really-
Mark's writing to the Romans. Luke's writing to the Greeks. John's writing to the church at large, although the church at large and unbelieving Jews is because he uses very Jewish ways of expressing himself. And he says at the very end, his point is so that they will believe that he's the Messiah. So, you got Matthew that's writing to the Jews as well, but John's would be more of a universal with a subset of probably Jews, particularly Jewish unbelievers in his gospel. Anyway, we don't know. So, yeah. Yeah, but thank you for the little diversion there. Okay, so this is the fifth of John's 7 signs. Remember, we've got 7 discourses of John. So John doesn't include a lot of the material the other synoptic gospels do. The synoptic gospels, a lot of times you'll see Matthew, Mark, and Luke telling the same story, or at least a couple of them telling it. John, a lot of times he's just left out. Occasionally he joins in, right? Like in the feeding of the 5,000, and in this case here. But John's set up in a very scripted way. He leaves out a ton, even at the end of his gospel. He says, like, look, if I could write down everything that happened, there wouldn't be enough, volumes, there wouldn't be enough libraries and books in the world to be able to contain everything that Jesus said it did. So John sets up his gospel account in 7s. 7 I am statements. Jesus is actually going to say the next time we meet, I am the bread of life, right? So 7 I am statements. He's going to have 7 signs, right? He's going to have 7 discourses of Christ. So he sets them up in groups of 7, 7 being the idea of perfection. And this happens to be the 7th sign that John records that demonstrates that, in fact, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. The 5th sign. Correct, yeah, the 5th sign. Okay, so what we see here is the disciples, just set the context here, the disciples got in the boat, the sun went down. Okay, so this is like twilight now. This is, the sun has set, or the sun is setting. It's twilight now. And they're out on the boat, and all of a sudden this wind picks up, right? And at the same time, though, Jesus is up in the hills praying, but he's watching them. So this is kind of odd, because either he's got really good Hawkeye vision, and maybe he does, because Sea of Galilee is big, but he clearly sees what's going on. So he doesn't see like waves and like a little speck. He clearly understands. So I think there's even sort of a miraculous part of what's going on here, because it says, and when evening came, the boat was out on sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. So Jesus is actually witnessing what's going on with his disciples, right? Now, the Sea of Galilee, if you've been there, a lot of times in the daytime, it's nice, it's calm, sunny. But at evening time, winds typically come up, and they typically come up unexpectedly, just out of nowhere, and they can be very violent storms, right? And of course, we just saw that just probably a few weeks ago in the life of the disciples, they got caught in another storm on the same sea. So you can imagine, just step back and put yourself in the disciples' shoes for a moment. They nearly lost their life in this massive storm, probably a few days or a matter of maybe weeks, maybe a month or so prior, not a lot of time. And now they're back out on the same sea. Now, I don't know if I were them, if I got back in the boat. I think I might just hike around. but they're back on the boat, and the same thing happens. They're absolutely in dire straits here in this whole thing. But the Sea of Galilee does have these severe storms. A lot of times it's a north wind or a westerly wind that starts in the evening time. So again, bad time for them to go out. Now, Jesus sends them out at a time when I think he's probably aware that if there's going to be an issue, it's going to happen at nighttime. So he sends them out, and I don't know, they might have said, can we just not, we got plenty of food here. Why don't we just park our cabooses here till the next morning, get up and, we'll all get in the boat and go on. But he sends them out at night. And then it says that when the strong wind came up, the disciples were in the middle of the lake. So they get out, they row out, they're a ways away from the land, and then the wind hits them. So, the reason why this is important is they don't have any options. They can't just immediately pull back on the shore. They can't swim back. They're in the middle of this very big lake, and they can't do anything about it. And of course, what's happening is they're trying to row, but whenever they row, there's a headwind. They literally can't make any movement, right? Yes, Mike.
Jesus be at the center of the storm then? I mean, would he have created this to teach them this lesson?
We don't know, like in the previous, so the question was Jesus basically the creator of the storm to teach him a lesson? We know in the prior storm that was a satanic result. Clearly Jesus knew what was going to happen. Okay, so this wasn't a mistake, or this didn't catch him by, he's not up there like praying, he's looking out there going, I hope they're having a good, sunset cruise, and all of a sudden things go crazy, and he's like, I better go down. And like, he knew it was going to happen. So I don't know the answer to that question, whether it was directly caused or whether he just knew it was going to happen. But so I don't know the answer to that. But certainly God's in control. So that whole thing happened under God's direction and control. This is probably the best way to answer that. So anyway, they're trying to row. They're in the middle of this lake. They've gone about 3 to 4 miles out in the middle. So they are really out there. And it says that they were straining at the oars. In other words, they're doing everything possible to keep this boat, to try to get it to some sort of land if they can, right? And John chapter 6 says, when evening came, the disciples went down to the sea, got on the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. That was where they were heading. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because of a strong wind was blowing, and they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. Now, a couple things here that are interesting to me just from a psychological perspective. Again, put yourself in the shoes of the disciples. They're in a boat, literally probably the same boat. I mean, when we say, hey, they're in the same boat, like metaphorically they're in the same boat, but also probably literally they're in the same boat. They're out in the same body of water, and the same thing happens to them, and again, it happens to them at night. And I don't know about you, but night's terrifying. Like my son likes, he's extremely interested in tornadoes. So he watched these tornado videos and stuff like that. And tornadoes are really they're fascinating. They're scary in the daytime, but in the daytime you can see them. Storm chasers can chase them in the daytime because they're easy to see, and they can cause some damage. And even if you're there, you can still kind of watch it and see if it's coming. Like, you can kind of avoid a lot of those ones. But it's the ones that happen, either they're called rain wrapped, where there's so much rain that these clouds can come in, they're dark, and you literally can't see the tornado. And it just absolutely frightens you. And the worst ones that cause the most damage and death are the ones that come at night, because you can't see anything. You have no idea what's going on. You have no idea if you're heading into the storm or out of the storm. So these guys here, they're out in the dark. And I imagine if I put myself in their shoes, I am absolutely freaked out. In the middle of the lake, there's nothing I can do. And we're getting swamped, and it's dark, and I can't see anything, right? No one brought a flashlight with them. Like, you're literally, and this is, and Jesus wasn't with them. Yes. Okay. So this is the situation that the disciples are in. And one could say from a purely human perspective, their reaction makes perfect sense. But Jesus is going to say, no, it doesn't make sense, because you should have learned an important lesson. Now, Jesus continues to pray well past midnight, because when he finally decides to go out into the water to save them, it's anywhere between 3 to 6 a.m. in the morning, right? So if the disciples left their boat to go to the boat at evening, which at that time in April probably would have been somewhere around 7, maybe 8 o'clock, he goes up in the hills to pray, and now he doesn't come down into the water until sometime between 3 to 6. So that could be anywhere between 9, 10, 11 hours where they're out in the storm, right? Going nowhere, right? And again, it's 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, if you think about this, the struggle that the disciples, just want you to put yourself in the shoes, because I think we find ourselves in very similar situations to them. And unfortunately, we react a lot like they do. But John says this, it says, when they rode about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, right? Well, we know that from the account that it's somewhere between 3 to 6 a.m. The fourth watch, according to Roman time, was 3 to 6 a.m., right? That was the last watch of the night, essentially, okay? So what is going on here then is that these disciples have been rowing against the wind and making no headway for probably 9, 10, 11 hours. I don't know about you, but I've been on a rowing machine. Anyone like to row? Does anyone here like to row? Okay, you like to row like a rowing machine, or just rowing in a boat? You're a rowing team. Okay, you guys, so you know about this.
Yeah.
If you're really not just out there just doing this whole thing, but if you're out there exerting as much energy as you can rowing, how long do you think you can row sustained?
That's not
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. So in other words, you've got, now of course they don't have rows. It's not like they have a boat where you've got, got 12 oars and everything else. But so they're obviously switching off, but you've got 9, 10, or 11 hours of rowing where you're making no headway. Not a little
Likely
bit.
that they make a little headway and then they get tired and they blow back and then that's probably,
Yeah.
that's,
So yes, so these guys here, you're right. They are frightened. Yeah, they're frightened. They are absolutely exhausted. They are mentally fatigued. In every single way, they are as demoralized physically, mentally, and emotionally as you can possibly be when Jesus comes out. Okay, that's the state that they are in. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is, remember that, again, I've said that this is the second time the exact same situation has happened. When you think about it in your life and my life, how many times is it like, here we go again? You and I were just talking about this before this started. Here I go again. Is this going to happen? I just got done with that, and now the same type of thing. Like, can I not get a break? And in life, we run into that.
I had the very situation today. I had to, because I had read this, it's like, honey, give it to Jesus.
Yeah.
Ask him for help.
Yeah.
If you're struggling with that, ask him for help, because she blew her stack at something that she has to do online, and she says, I hate dealing with these people. It's like, settle down,
Yeah.
read the fine print.
Yeah.
We got through it, but man, she exploded, and yeah.
But it's hard. And again, some of us have been, go through the storm doesn't cease. I mean, 9 or 10 hours is sort of, the exhaustion they felt is what you felt for 9 or 10 years or 30 years of something that just is unrelenting, doesn't stop. And so when we put ourselves here, this is the situation. So we can relate to the disciples and say, what should we do? We know what they did, and what they did is not what we should do, or at least part of what they did is not what we should do. All right. Now, it's interesting, you notice that it says that, Mark says he meant to pass by them. That seems really odd. Now, when you read it, it sounds very uncaring. So here they've been out there 9, 10, 11 hours. They think they're going to die. They're completely exhausted. And Jesus then starts walking on the water. And he sees them, and it sort of sounds like he's like, well, there you go, guys. He kind of waves to him. And he's like, I'm just going to, he intended to pass by and say, I'll see you on the shore. it feels like he is like there's something untoward going on, and that's actually not the way that we should interpret that at all. What it meant by that is to pass by meant that, we shouldn't think of it this way, that he's walking towards the boat and the boat's going this way and he's coming this way and he's just going to kind of like two ships pass in the night, and as he passes by, he keeps going. What it passed by means to come alongside. So he intended to come alongside the boat with them. That was his intention. In fact, that's actually, we see from the text, that's exactly what he did. And the idea there that should sort of generate is this idea of how God in the Old Testament is said to pass by several circumstances. So that what we should think of here is we should think of this as Jesus is participating in a theophany experience that is what the intention of that statement is, passing by. So for instance, these are just a couple of them. In Exodus 33:19, he says, and this is to Moses, I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, and I will be gracious to whom I'm gracious and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. In 1 Kings 19:10-11, again, this is Elijah who's up there in the cave hiding. By the way, same mountain as Moses. Okay, same mountain as Moses. He said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, go out, and this is God. He's talking to Elijah. Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not an earthquake, and it goes on. So this idea, and these are just a couple instances where God passes by an individual as this theophany experience of God. So that's how we should actually interpret what is going on here, is that Jesus is coming along and he comes along to pass beside them, to go beside them, and that should, the disciples should call that into mind. That should have been the experience that they had. Now, this is what Meyer says in his book, A Marginal Jew. He says, Jesus revealed himself to his disciples in all his divine majesty and power by demonstrating his dominion over the unruly forces of wind, sea, and waves. He acts towards them as Yahweh, or Yahweh's personified divine wisdom acts in the Old Testament. He's referring back to these theophany experiences that you see in the Old Testament, that's what they should have actually experienced and thought about. All right, now, he intends to pass by, which he actually is doing. So he's passing by the boat. Now, a lot of times you'll see, and we don't know exactly how far away from the boat is, but I think when we read the account, we realize that he's actually very close. Like a lot of times when I've imagined this in my head, like he's like way off in the distance. They can kind of sort of see, like, is it a man? Oh, maybe does that look like Jesus? Like he's far enough away. It's dark, that type of a thing. And so when Peter walks in the water, I always imagine that Peter walks and he takes like 50 steps or 100 steps. Like he's walking a little ways and then he falls. What we see here is that's not the case. That it appears that Jesus is actually very close to the boat, and that Peter himself, while he does start to walk on the water, it's not like he walks a long ways, right? And I'll kind of point that out, but that's the whole idea of passing by. He was very near and close to the boat. Now, because of this, it says that the disciples, they were terrified and they cried out in great fear because they see this figure walking on water. Now, before this time, there is no account in Jewish literature of anyone walking on water. So you can understand that the disciples would be pretty frightened. Not every day you're out in the boat and you see someone walking on water. Like, it's a pretty freaky event, right? But it does say that they thought it was a ghost or a phantasma, which is a water phantom. And Mark also says that all saw him. So it's not a hallucination. Some people who've tried to sort of get rid of this miracle have given explanations. One of them is that, there's a hallucination. Well, we know that mass hallucinations like that don't happen, right? That's not how hallucinations work. Hallucination is in your mind. And so they all saw him, so it's not a hallucination. Some people have said that they were in the boat and it was Jesus walking along the shore. Well, remember, they're 3 to 4 miles out. When you're 3 to 4 miles away from the shore, you can't see squat. I mean, you might be able to maybe even pick out some movement, but you don't have any idea even what it is, much less whether or not it's Jesus, right? And by the way, if it was him, he still would have had to walk out to them in the boat because they were still 3 to 4 miles. So even if he was on the shore, he still had to walk out. Like there's just, it's kind of silly how people try to do that. Some people said, well, maybe he was like surfing. He's on a big old log and Jesus is just out there on the waves. And like the first instance of surfing in literature is him out there on this log out there surfing or whatever else. Anyway, that's just pure nonsense. Yeah, now Lax in his rabbinic commentary on the New Testament says this. He says, an example of a ghost in the Masoretic text, the Masoretic text, that's the Old Testament that was written in Hebrew, is an example of this in the Masoretic text is the spirit of Samuel raised from the dead by the witch of Endor. Seeing strange phenomenon on the waters is recorded in several passages in rabbinic literature. Now, not necessarily seeing people, but seeing you're out there at night and on the water. In rabbinic literature, they did record that there was these kind of eerie things that people would associate with ghosts. So that's the first thing they went to. Imagine that. You just think about this as the disciples. That's the first thing you go to when you see Jesus walking on the water, and the first thing in your mind is we're seeing a ghost, like some mystical type of a thing. Like they're like it's Halloween. It's first instance of Halloween right here. Like they're, this misty, whatever else, ghost walking on the water.
Fear before we have faith.
True. No, exactly right. But it's interesting that that's the first thing that they go to. Now, Fruchtenbaum says this. He says, perhaps the disciples were fearful because they thought this approaching figure was the angel of death. Now, that's also something that we find the Jews, knew about, because the angel of death is in the Old Testament, right? We see a couple times of that in the Old Testament, and they did think that, I remember Zechariah in the temple, John the Baptist's father. They thought that the angel of death had visited him because he didn't come out, right? And that's what they thought, is like maybe the angel of death has come and killed him. So these are all things that, of course, occurred in the disciples' mind. Now, the application that we have here is that it's okay to be terrified. Here's the thing. It's okay to be terrified. There are fearful things. Like there are times when things come up. This isn't a Pollyannish look like you shouldn't experience fear. That's not the thing. But when you experience the fear, when those trials and troubles come, what do you do? Well, they chose to not only embrace the fear, but then to look at it as perhaps it was a ghost. All right, now, here are some incredible words of Christ that I think are like really important, right? This is what he says. For they all saw him and were terrified. Well, they again, he's close to the boat. They can see who it is, and yet they're still terrified. So they're worked up. They've been out there for a long time. But watch this. Immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid, right?
Be of good cheer.
Be of good cheer, correct. Okay. Now, notice that the word here is that immediately. So when they see him, he doesn't just sit back and be like, okay, let's see what they're going to do. I mean, certainly he put them out there in the situation. But when they are expressing this fear and this terror, he is immediately then there to meet with them, right? His object and goal is not to see them suffer or whatever else. There is a lesson to be learned, but it says immediately he spoke to them, right? And notice what he says to them. He uses several words. He says, first of all, take courage. And notice this command to take courage occurs 7 times in the New Testament. And it's always on the lips of Jesus, except for Mark 10:49. Every time take courage is used in the New Testament, except for one example, is Jesus. Like, that's his thing. Take courage. And that's what he tells us. I mean, this is applicable to us. Take courage. This is the words of the Messiah, almost uniquely Jesus. In other words, almost unique way of expressing it in the New Testament is this idea of take courage. He also says, don't be afraid, which literally means stop fearing. Like, I'm here, stop fearing. But then he also says, be of good cheer, tharseo. And again, this is used only in relation to Jesus in the New Testament. Be of good cheer. In other words, have your spirit enlivened and joy and he's basically asking for a complete turnaround. You notice that there's two things here. Don't be afraid, one end of the spectrum, which is where you're living, and be of good cheer. Like, I'm commanding you right now to change your perspective. Go from the complete opposite on one end of shaking in fear to the complete opposite. I'm here. It's your perspective. But guess what? Here's the thing. The wind and the waves are still what? Blowing. So he gives the command to not be afraid. He gives the command to be of good cheer, not when everything is calmed down, but in the very midst of the storm. Right? That's what he calls us to do. In the midst of the storm, what is our perspective? Like, we can totally lose it, or we can still be of good cheer, be encouraged, even though we don't have any idea how the situation is going to work out. But that's his command to the disciples, and that's his commands to us, right? And we see in Isaiah that the idea of not being afraid or take courage, they're very familiar Old Testament. I just don't include one example here. In Isaiah 41:10, it says, "Fear not, for I'm with you. Be not dismayed, for I'm your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Right? The same God in the Old Testament says, "Don't be afraid. I'm here," is exactly what Jesus says, "I'm here." Okay? Now, he says, "It is I," right? And literally, this is "I am." Now, there is a debate here about whether or not when he says, "It is I," again, he'll say this in the Garden of Gethsemane too, that the literal interpretation is "I am," right? He didn't say "I am Jesus" or "I am he," just says "I am." Now, some say that he's just identifying who he is, "It is I, Jesus," but of course he doesn't add that. He doesn't say "It is I, Jesus." He just says "I am," literally "I am." So more likely in this case, he is trying to drive into the point that in fact, I am is here. Not just somebody. I am is in your very presence. And in fact, when he says "I am" in the garden, we all know what happens. The soldiers get knocked over on their backsides, right? So we know that that is an indication there of the Yahweh's "I am." And so we should probably take this one in the same way, that Jesus is identifying himself with Yahweh from the Old Testament. Okay. Now, of course, he says this, "Don't be afraid, be of good cheer, I am." And then Peter, though, of course, we might have thought this was, doubting Thomas, but Peter is the one that basically he's not convinced yet, right? And, Peter's a little bit like us. Sometimes we're not quite convinced that God actually is there for us. Sometimes we're not convinced that God actually cares enough for us or that he's going to intervene. And so Peter's in the same situation. I'm just not sure it's you. So he says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And of course, Jesus just gives him a command. One command: come. Doesn't try to convince him, just says, come. Now, Peter actually has two sides of faith here. One side is that he starts out in faith. Notice that as soon as Jesus says, come, he gets out of the water and he starts walking towards where Christ is. And again, only Matthew records this walk of Peter on the water. And in fact, like I said, this is the only example we have in recorded history of two men ever walking on water, and that'd be Jesus and Peter. Now, the problem with Peter is he starts out in faith, but he doesn't end in faith, right? Because he all of a sudden, he's looking at Christ, he's walking, takes his eyes off on him, looks at the wind and looks at the waves, and of course, at that point, he starts to sink, and then he cries out. Now, notice that as he starts to sink, he cries out immediately, which is to Peter's credit, right? And notice that Christ immediately reaches out his hand and saves him. So I always envision like Peter's going on the waves and he's gulping for water, and you can just see the hands, flailing above a little bit. that's not the picture here. It says, as he started to sink, he cries out, and Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and grabs a hold of him and saves him, right? Now,
Shows to, and went into the water. Coming up to get to.
yeah, well, that's not how it appears here. It appears that as he starts to sink, he realizes, save me, like this, and he reaches out, and then Christ. Now remember, Christ is close enough, because if immediately Christ reaches out his hand to get him, he's got to be within reaching distance. Okay, right? So that's the reason why I think we can make some determinations there. So application here is just like Peter. We can start out in faith, and then we just let the world start to crash in on us, and then we don't end in faith. We stop. Now, to Peter's credit, he recognizes that and immediately cries back out again. So if we are going to find ourselves in Peter's situation, which we do, sometimes we start in faith and sometimes we lose it. But if we're going to follow Peter's example, we need to quickly regain it. Once we realize that we've stopped walking in faith, realize that we've stopped trusting in the Lord, that's when we immediately need to reach back out again and say, Lord, save me. So we have to continue on in faith as part of the application. All right. Almost done here.
Because that's why Jesus said to him, "Well, you gotta
Yeah, I mean, Jesus rebukes Peter for his lack of faith here, right? He says here, but when he saw the wind and the wave, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, again, we might look at this and say, well, Jesus, that's a little harsh. I mean, look, the second time they've been out in the boat, second time that they think they're going to die. I mean, they're exhausted. Like, from a human perspective, it just seems a little bit like maybe Jesus being harsh. I mean, look, none of us have ever walked on water before. So you walk on, tell you what, you try walking on water. You try walking on water when there's waves all around you. And then you start to, you see what you would do. Like, Peter is very human in this perspective. And so you might say, well, cut him some slack. But here's why Jesus doesn't cut him some slack. He has just got done in the feeding of the 5,000, showing that he is the creator of the universe. He creates this food out of nothing. I mean, not nothing. He had bread and the fish, but literally he's creating matter that doesn't exist. The matter was the bread and the fish that existed, but he then created more. So he's literally in the creative process. The creator of the universe is continuing in this very moment to create more matter. And he shows that he can do all of this type of stuff. He's just done that a matter of 9 or 10 hours before. And and then there's this reaction. So Jesus is just like, look, I just left you. It almost reminds you of the Garden of Gethsemane. Like, can you pray with me? He comes back and they're all asleep. Like, can't you even do this? Like, I literally just left you. I literally just did this for you, and then you guys freak out and you lose it. So, there's a reason why he's saying this whole thing here. I think the application here that we have to understand is that, obedience doesn't mean that the obstacles are removed. Remember, Jesus commanded him to come before the wind and the wave stopped. When he asks you to go do something to be faithful, it doesn't mean that the wind and the waves are going to stop. In fact, he may ask you to walk on the water in the wind and the waves. He may not even remove those obstacles. He may just say, keep walking. Keep walking back to shore with the wind and the wave. He could have told Peter, just walk back to shore, and it may have been a long walk for Peter. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that just because we're experiencing difficulties doesn't mean we're outside of God's will. The whole health and prosperity gospel that's out there, like, if you're following God's will, he's going to bless you. You're going to have health, and you're going to be rich, and your family's going to be great, and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. That's the teaching. Well, we hardly ever see anything like that happen in Scripture. In fact, almost 9 times out of 10, or probably even more than that, you find out that when you follow Jesus, when you follow God, it doesn't lead to lack of difficulties. It creates more difficulties in your life.
seek God, seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be given.
No, all these things he's talked about is what? No. In specific, you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about food, like the basic necessities of life. If you seek God, he's going to make sure, remember he feeds the birds, the flowers, whatever. He's just talking about the mere existence, but he's not saying if you do that, you're going to live in a palace. So that is completely, he's talking about if you do these things, the basic needs will be provided for you. So the other applications, just because we've got difficulty doesn't mean we're outside of his will. He specifically told Peter to come. So when Peter came, he was in God's will, but yet the difficulties were not removed, right? So we shouldn't buy into this health, wealth, and prosperity gospel that's out there. It just is not true. All right.
Sure sounds good.
It sounds good. All right, now I got to get ripping because I do want to make sure I end here on time. Actually, we're over time, so let me just get through this here. It says, when the disciples recognized him, they welcomed him into the boat. And then when Jesus and Peter, get into the boat, the wind died down, right? It stopped. It rested. In other words, it's the idea of complete and total peace. Like everything went from just chaos to just glass, right? The sea is glass. And it happened as soon as Jesus and Peter were back inside the boat, right? Now, it says that the disciples, they were completely amazed. In other words, it's literally, the idea is out of their mind. Like they are just like, they cannot believe what they have seen just happen because of what Jesus has just demonstrated. Again, this is not the first time that they or others have been out of their mind. And appropriately, they worship him, right? They understood that he is the Son of God, and they made a right decision about who he was and his identity. So they're growing in their knowledge of who Jesus is. And they do respond appropriately to that. But we do realize that overall, even though they ended up with the right conclusion and the right response, that the testing that he made them go through, they failed the test. They did recognize him at the very end, but they failed the test, right? Now, Mark, of course, tells us that, in fact, their heart was hard. They didn't understand. He says here, Mark, they didn't understand the meaning of the loaves miracle. So Mark ties it in to say, look, they didn't pass the test. If they had learned the lesson of the loaves, that he is in control, when he asks you to go do something, he will provide, then they would not have found themselves in this situation, right? They would have responded completely differently. Now remember, Jesus so far has tested the disciples 3 times. Sent them on the 2x2 mission, they passed that. Feeding the 5,000, they failed that test. The storm on the sea, they failed the test. And this is why Mark says that their hearts were hardened. Now, it doesn't mean that they're hardened against Christ like this. It just meant that spiritually, their hearts were hard. They still had not spiritually understood who Jesus was to the point where they would have made the right decision, right? Now, I like what Fruchtenbaum says about this. He says, here's an example of good theology but bad application. The disciples clearly knew he was the Son of God, that's good theology, but they had not learned to depend on him, bad application. They became fearful in a situation in which they should have trusted the Lord. Spiritual life without good theology is impossible. On the other hand, good theology without good application will result in spiritual deadness. The believer must apply good theology to daily life. And that's really our lesson here. Some of us know a lot, and we don't apply it. Some of us try to apply it, but we don't know what we're applying because we don't have good theology. It's a mix of both of those together that leads to an abundant, mature life, like the writer of Hebrews talks about, leading us on to maturity. Proper theology, good application. All right. Now, the very last thing that we have here is that it says that they were glad to take him in the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they're going. So not only when they get in the boat does everything stop, but they're parked at the dock. I mean, this is the other miracle. It's not just that Jesus walks on water or that Peter walks on water. It's the fact that they are instantaneously from one moment in the middle of the lake, and then as soon as Jesus gets in the boat, everything dies down, and they're just like, that's right. We see this a couple times. We see this right here where they go from one place to another, that this transportation thing. Remember, Philip in the book of Acts happens the same thing with him. He's the Ethiopian eunuch. He goes down and baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch, and all of a sudden, poof, Philip is gone. God transports him to a completely different part of the area, right? So this is just another example of transportation, going from here to here. Like this is the first teleporter This is way before sci-fi has happened. Again, so they reached the shore, Capernaum, 3 to 4 miles away. And the application that we have here is we just wrap these two things together is that the feed of 5,000, Jesus is the bread of life. He provides for us. He asks us to feed others, but he also provides for us. And then the storm is that he protects us, but he does expect us to cry out to him. He does expect us to look to him for resolving the situation, right? We can sit there and row all we want on our own might, and we're not going to get anywhere. So the application is, yeah, he's going to protect us, but we have to acknowledge him. We have to acknowledge our need for him and then allow him to intercede.
You have to start with faith and finish it.
Correct, 100%. All right, any real, thank you, Bill. Any last questions that we have here before we go? I'll take a couple quick questions if you have any, or comments.
How far away is it? from Dakota from here?
It's
I think it's 1,292 miles.
yeah, it's away about 17 to 18 hours of driving. Yeah,
Where you staying?
Butte. It's a Butte.
We'll take it 90.
Yeah, 90. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Oh, sorry, one last thing. I apologize. One last thing. We aren't going to meet next week. The facility is not available for us, so we will not be meeting next week. So it'll be 2 weeks before we get back together again. Yeah, when we get back together again, we're going to really tear into this big, long passage in John about the bread of life. So read it. That thing's got a ton of stuff in it. So take your time, read through it, and then we'll start breaking that down the next time we meet.
1,200 miles.
For safety,
Sure. Let me just hold on. Let me just stop the recording here, and then I'll.
He won't even have it online next week?
Okay. Stop. Okay. Stop recording.